Great. There's been a lot of talk about sort of income inequality and wealth distribution in the United States, and it's been an increase in inequality and in this gap. So could you maybe talk about that increase in inequality in the United States?
Sure. In the United States, I think we have to look back to, I'd say, the last 40 years, back to the early 1970s. We've seen a really dramatic increase in income inequality. We're beginning to see more attention paid to it, both in terms of popular consciousness, popular movements, and to some extent now in commentary, among economic and political commentators, academic economists, and so on. The share of total income, or the percent of total income that goes to the top 10% of people, if you ranked everybody by income, and then you say, let's take that top 10% of that ranking and ask how much of the total income goes to people who are in that top 10% of the ranking. Well, if we were answering that question back in the early 1970s, the answer would have been somewhere between 30 and 35% of the total income. So about a third of the total income was going to the top 10% of the US population by income ranking. If we answer that question now, it's about 50%. So that's a big increase. Now we can zoom in, and this is where the language of Occupy Wall Street and the divide between the 1% and the 99% comes in. Well, what if we zoom in into that top 10% and say, what if we look at just the top 1%? The top 1%, again, if we were answering that question in the 1970s, got somewhere less than about 10% of the total income. So that was the top 1% of the population by income ranking, got just a little bit less than 10% of the total income. Now it's over 20%. So another way to think of that is that the top 1/10 of the population now gets about 5 times more than what an equal share of the total income would be.
So how is it possible that inequality increases as opposed to, there's a gap and then that stays steady between a richer person and a poorer person? How is it that this increase in inequality comes about?
That we need to think about different groups in society in a different way, really, to answer that question. And it's really helpful there to focus on the type of income or the source of income. And now here we can think about one group of people who gets their income primarily from work, from compensation for work. And that's the vast majority of the population get the vast majority of their income as wages and salaries and other forms of labor compensation. Well, that's not everyone, because there are people who primarily get their incomes by owning things. They are owners of private businesses and they employ other people for pay. In addition, we want to think there of people who are people who make their income by owning money capital, and so they, for instance, may be creditors to someone else, and that's a way that they use their property to generate additional income. And so broadly, we want to think of this other group of people, of capitalists, as being people who are owners of property that generate additional income. And so that's what we'll say, this is a kind of great divide in the United States and other capitalist societies, is to think about these different sources or types of income. Now that fits with the story that we see when we look at the income share of the top 10% or the income share of the top 1%. Why? Because most property income goes to people who are at the very top of the income distribution. People who have low incomes and people who have moderate incomes get very little of their incomes from property. It's the case that now over 50% of property income goes to people in the top 1% of the income ranking. So That's really quite extraordinary. That's 50 times what an equal share of property income would be.